Every year, the global anti-inflammatory supplement industry collects roughly $40 billion from people who are in pain, exhausted, and desperate for an answer. $40 billion for capsules, powders, and proprietary blends that didn't exist a century ago, and in most cases, haven't been tested for longer than a few years. Meanwhile, scattered across the oldest texts in human history, the scrolls of Egypt, the medical canons of Persia, the dietary laws of Leviticus, the herbal compendiums of the Tang dynasty, there are quiet, specific instructions. Eat this. Prepare it this way. Use it at this time of year. These weren't suggestions. They were survival knowledge, refined over generations by people who had no other medicine. What researchers are now beginning to understand is just how precise that knowledge was. Today, we're breaking down 12 foods documented in ancient scripture, used across independent civilizations, and now examined by modern nutritional science that directly address the inflammatory processes that accelerate after the age of 60. And most of these are not exotic. Most of them are already in your kitchen or a short walk from your door. Pay close attention to number 1. It's something almost every culture on Earth has used for thousands of years. And it operates through a mechanism most people, even health professionals, have never heard of. And stay with us through number 7. There's a story there about a man in the desert, 3 days without food, abandoned and close to death. And what saved him has a scientific explanation that's only been articulated in the last decade. This is not a supplement list. This is a food list. Let's begin. Number 12. Dark berries. In the Book of Numbers, the scouts sent into Canaan returned, carrying a single cluster of grapes, so heavy it required 2 men and a pole to carry it. That passage, Numbers 1323, has long been read as a symbol of abundance. But read it through a nutritional lens, and something else emerges, a civilization that recognized deeply colored fruit as carrying exceptional value, not ornamentation. Provision. Across cultures and centuries, dark berries occupied that same elevated status. In traditional Ayurvedic medicine, the Indian gooseberry, known as amalaki, was classified as a rasayana, a class of foods believed to slow the aging process itself. In Mesoamerican tradition, the dark-fleshed sapote was considered sacred food for elders. Norse and Celtic peoples gathered bilberries wild, intensely pigmented cousins of the blueberry in late summer, preserving them through winter. The pattern is consistent deep color signals. Deep medicine, modern science has now named what ancient observers could only taste. The pigments in dark berries, anthocyanins, from the Greek for dark blue flower, are potent polyphenols that directly interrupt inflammatory signaling pathways in the body. Specifically, they suppress the activity of nuclear factor, kappa B, which functions as something like an inflammation master switch. When NF-κB is overactivated, as it tends to be in aging bodies, it drives chronic, systemic inflammation linked to joint deterioration, cognitive decline, and cardiovascular disease. Research, published in peer-reviewed journals, has found that regular berry consumption, roughly 1 to 2 cups most days, is associated with measurably lower levels of C-reactive protein, a primary inflammatory marker. One study found cognitive effects equivalent to being 11 years younger in those who consumed daily servings of berries rich in flavonoids. Black currants, blackberries, blueberries, and wild bilberries offer the highest anthocyanin concentrations. Mixing varieties is not merely convenient. Each species carries a slightly different molecular profile, and the combination appears to produce broader coverage across inflammatory pathways. If fresh berries are seasonal or expensive where you live, quality frozen berries are nutritionally equivalent. The freezing process preserves anthocyanins well. What does not preserve them well is heat above 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which degrades these delicate compounds significantly. If you use dried berries or powders, look specifically for freeze-dried products, where the cold process maintains the polyphenol spectrum. Stir a handful into overnight oats. The cold soak protects the compounds, Layer them into plain yogurt, or eat them straight. In the morning, before anything else has touched your palate. What the ancient world called blessed fruit, the laboratory now calls a phytochemical delivery system. The vocabulary is different. The observation is the same. Number 11. Dark leafy greens. The Book of Daniel. Chapter 1. Records one of the earliest documented clinical trials in history, though no one called it that at the time. Daniel and 3 companions refuse the rich food of the Babylonian court and ask instead to be fed only vegetables and water for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, the text records, they appeared healthier and better nourished than the young men who ate the royal food. That account, written roughly 500 years ago, describes something. Nutritional researchers are still investigating the profound systemic effect of a diet anchored in dark, bitter, mineral-rich greens. Those greens appear throughout ancient medical literature with remarkable consistency. Egyptian papyri from the Ebers collection, compiled around 1550 BCE, document the therapeutic use of fenugreek leaves and bitter herbs for what was described as swelling and heat in the joints. Language that maps closely onto what we now call inflammatory arthritis. Hippocrates built his dietary prescriptions around greens as well, famously locating the source of most human illness in poor digestion and recommending bitter herbs to stimulate and restore it. In China's Ming Dynasty, Binchao Gangmu, the Great Pharmacopoeia, compiled by Li Shizhen in 1596. Dark greens occupy multiple chapters with observations about their effects on what translates roughly as wind heat. One of the classical Chinese descriptions of inflammatory states, the mechanism that unites these traditions, is now well understood. Dark leafy greens: spinach, kale, Swiss chard, cavolo nero, rocket. Collard greens are concentrated sources of carotenoids, particularly lutein and beta-carotene, which function as internal antioxidants, neutralizing the reactive oxygen species that trigger inflammatory cascades. They are also rich in vitamin K1, which plays a documented role in suppressing inflammatory cytokines, and in folate, which supports the methylation pathways that regulate gene expression, including inflammatory genes. A landmark study found that people who consumed daily servings of leafy greens showed rates of cognitive aging equivalent to being 11 years younger, results attributed specifically to the carotenoid and vitamin K content. 80 grams a day, roughly 1 generous handful of raw leaves, appears sufficient to sustain these effects. One preparation note that ancient cooks understood intuitively alternating between raw and cooked greens is not just variety for its own sake. Cooking breaks down the cell walls and releases fat-soluble carotenoids more efficiently, but heat also degrades water-soluble folate. Raw leaves preserve the folate. Cooked leaves deliver more carotenoids. Rotating between both is not a modern nutritional hack. It is what every traditional cuisine that relied heavily on greens already practiced. 1 tablespoon of cold-pressed olive oil added to cooked greens increases carotenoid absorption by up to 400%. That specific pairing greens and olive oil appears in Mediterranean cuisine, in Levantine cooking, in Indian sag preparations, not by coincidence. Number 10. Sprouts. In the Gospel of John, chapter 12, Jesus uses the image of a seed falling into the ground as his central metaphor for transformation and hidden potential. The seed that dies, he says, produces many seeds. The image was theological, but it reaches towards something botanically true that nutritional science has only recently measured precisely. A seed at the moment of germination is undergoing the most metabolically intense transformation of its entire life cycle. Every defense compound, every enzyme, every anti-predator chemical the mature plant will carry is being synthesized in concentrated form during those first days of growth. The sprout is not a young version of the plant. It is the plant at maximum biochemical concentration. This was not lost on ancient healers. The Talmud records the use of sprouted fenugreek as a medicinal preparation. Ayurvedic physicians specifically distinguished between dried seeds and sprouted seeds. classifying the latter as more therapeutically active. In certain Chinese medical traditions, sprouted mung beans, not mature mung beans, were the prescribed form for patients with inflammatory conditions, including what was described as damp heat in the joints. What modern research has confirmed is that broccoli sprouts in particular contain concentrations of sulforaphane measured at up to 50 times the level found in mature broccoli. Sulforaphane's mechanism of action is unusually well understood. It activates a transcription factor called NRF2, which functions as a master regulator of the body's internal antioxidant and detoxification response. When NRF2 is switched on, the body produces its own endogenous antioxidant enzymes, glutathione, catalase, superoxide dismutase, rather than relying solely on dietary antioxidants. A controlled trial involving 40 healthy, overweight adults found that 30 grams of fresh broccoli sprouts consumed daily for 10 weeks reduced inflammatory markers including interleukin, 6, and C-reactive protein by up to 59%. Those are clinical trial numbers. For a food, that is extraordinary. There is one important preparation note. Sulforaphane is released when the enzyme myrosinase comes into contact with glucoraphanin, its precursor compound. This reaction requires the sprouts to be chewed thoroughly. Heat above 140 degrees Fahrenheit deactivates myrosinase and prevents the conversion. This means broccoli sprouts should never be cooked. Add them to warm grain bowls only after the bowl has cooled slightly. Pile them raw on avocado toast. Toss them into salads at the last moment. Soak seeds in water for 8 hours. Drain and rinse twice daily. In 5 days, the sprouts are ready. No soil. No special equipment. A jar and a piece of cheesecloth. The most concentrated anti-inflammatory food available. Grown on a countertop. The seed, dormant, holds everything. The sprout, emerging, releases it. Number 9. Extra virgin olive oil. In the Psalms, specifically Psalm 23, the shepherd king writes, "You anoint my head with oil." The image is pastoral comfort, but anointing with oil in the ancient Near East carried medical significance as well as ceremonial meaning. Olive oil was applied to wounds, mixed into medicinal preparations, and consumed as a daily food in quantities that modern nutritionists would recognize immediately as therapeutic. The Hebrew word for olive oil shemen appears over 200 times in the Old Testament. It was used as currency, as tribute, as temple offering, as fuel, and as food. The Mishnah describes specific grades of oil from first cold press to subsequent pressings with different qualities and purposes. That ancient grading system maps almost exactly onto what we now call extra virgin versus refined olive oil. The ancients understood that the first pressing contained something the later pressings did not. What it contains, we now know, is oleocanthal, a phenolic compound first isolated by scientists in 2005, who noticed that fresh extra virgin olive oil produced the same throat sensation as liquid ibuprofen. Further investigation confirmed that oleocanthal inhibits the same COX-1 and COX-2, enzymes targeted by non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Through a nearly identical mechanism, the effect is gentle and cumulative rather than acute. This is not a painkiller, but consumed daily, the effect builds. 2 to 3 tablespoons of high polyphenol extra virgin olive oil provides an estimated equivalent of around 10% of an adult ibuprofen dose delivered as whole food, without the gastric side effects associated with chronic NSAID use. A study published in the Annals of Clinical and Translational Neurology found that even 7 grams per day less than 2 teaspoons was associated with a 28% lower risk of dying from dementia-related causes. The critical variable is quality. Oleocanthal and its companion compound oleuropein degrade with heat, light, and time. Cold-pressed. Stored in dark glass, and ideally used within 12 months of the harvest date. Not the bottling date is the standard. A taste test confirms quality immediately fresh. High polyphenol olive oil produces a distinct peppery sensation at the back of the throat. That pepper is the oleocanthal. If the oil is mild, smooth, and neutral tasting, the active compounds have likely degraded. Look for oils that publish polyphenol content. The target is a minimum of 250 milligrams per liter. Contrary to persistent myth, extra virgin olive oil is entirely suitable for low to medium heat cooking. Its polyphenols protect the oil from oxidative degradation at temperatures below its smoke point of approximately 180 degrees Celsius. The ancients cooked with it. The Mediterranean world has always cooked with it. The research supports it. Drizzle it cold over vegetables. Use it to finish soups. Add it to warm, not boiling water with lemon in the morning. 2 tablespoons. Every day. Number 8. Walnuts and tree nuts. Genesis 4:3-11 records Jacob instructing his sons to carry specific provisions to Egypt as a gift balm. Honey, spices, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds in the ancient Near East. Tree nuts were not common provisions. They were luxury items, gifts given to rulers. Offerings carried across borders. Their value was understood. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, recommends preparations involving ground nuts for conditions marked by swelling and pain. Roman agricultural writers Columella, Pliny the Elder, documented walnut cultivation with the same attention given to olives and grapes, noting their therapeutic as well as nutritional properties. In Persian traditional medicine, Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine classified walnuts as warming foods with specific benefits for the head and the brain, a classification that looks different once you know that the walnut's brain-like appearance is not merely coincidence. It is one of the highest plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids, which are directly involved in brain structure and anti-inflammatory signaling. The specific compound at the center of walnut research is alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, a plant-based omega-3 that the body converts partially into the longer chain forms EPA and DHA that directly modulate inflammatory pathways. Walnuts are also exceptional sources of ellagic acid, a polyphenol that gut bacteria convert into urolithin A, a compound now being investigated in clinical trials for its ability to stimulate mitophagy, the cellular housekeeping process by which damaged mitochondria are cleared and replaced. Impaired mitophagy is associated with accelerated aging and chronic inflammation. A single daily serving of walnuts, about 28 grams. A small handful has been associated in multiple studies with lower levels of inflammatory biomarkers including C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, as well as a 19% reduction in cardiovascular risk. Pecans, almonds, and chestnuts all carry significant polyphenol loads as well, with chestnuts being notably high in gallic acid, a compound with well-documented anti-inflammatory activity. The preparation instruction here is simple but frequently overlooked. Buy whole, unsalted nuts, and store them in a cool, dark place or in the refrigerator. The polyunsaturated fats in walnuts oxidize quickly when exposed to heat and light, and oxidized fats are themselves pro-inflammatory. A rancid walnut detectable by a sharp, bitter, slightly paint-like taste has crossed from anti-inflammatory food to the opposite. When in doubt, taste one before using the rest. 28 grams. A small jar on the counter. The same gift Jacob sent to Pharaoh. Available for a few dollars at any market. Number 7. Seeds. The story of Elijah. 1 Kings 19 opens with the prophet Elijah in total collapse. He has just won the most dramatic confrontation of his life, a contest with 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. A moment of triumph that immediately gave way to threat. Queen Jezebel issued a death warrant, and Elijah, who hours before had called down fire from heaven, ran. He ran into the desert, collapsed under a broom tree, and asked to die. "It is enough," he said. "Take my life." He fell asleep. What happened next is told in just a few verses. but it is one of the most medically interesting passages in all of Scripture. An angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." He looked, and there at his head was a cake, baked on hot coals, and a jar of water. He ate, he drank, and he lay down again. The angel came a second time and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." He arose, he ate and drank, and on the strength of that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights. That specific food, a cake baked on coals, has been interpreted variously by scholars, but in the context of what Bedouin and desert traveling cultures have relied on for millennia for exactly this kind of sustained journey, the most plausible candidate is a dense, seed-based flatbread, sesame, flax, ground grain, high fat, high protein, shelf-stable, calorie dense, the kind of food engineered by experience for precisely this purpose, to restore a depleted body and sustain an extended journey. That isn't just poetry, that is a description of metabolic restoration. Flax seeds contain the lignin SDG sequasolariciolor diglucoside, one of the most thoroughly researched plant anti-inflammatory compounds, with documented effects on C-reactive protein and IL-6 at doses of 10 to 30 grams per day. Ground flax is essential. Whole seeds pass through the digestive system largely intact. Undigested, the outer hull must be broken to release the lignans and omega-3 fats. Store ground flax in the refrigerator to prevent oxidation. Sesame seeds carry sesamin and sesamolin lignans specific to sesame that protect vascular endothelium and reduce oxidative stress in arterial walls. Tahini stone-ground sesame paste delivers these compounds in a highly bioavailable form. 2 tablespoons stirred into warm water with a little lemon makes a simple, ancient preparation still used across the Middle East. Hemp seeds are uniquely positioned among plant foods. They contain an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of approximately 3 to 1, which is close to the ratio considered optimal for anti-inflammatory physiology. Most modern diets run at 15 to 1 or higher, heavily skewed toward pro-inflammatory omega-6 fats. 3 tablespoons of hemp seeds, about 30 grams, provides 10 grams of complete protein and a meaningful corrective to that ratio. A small handful of mixed seeds each day. Ground flax in the morning. Tahini on vegetables at midday. Hemp seeds over a grain bowl in the evening. Elijah ate once, rested, ate again, and walked for 40 days. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, the idea that the most important health discoveries weren't made in a laboratory, but observed over centuries and written into the oldest books we have hit, like and subscribe, because what comes next goes even deeper. We're about to get into the foods that ancient physicians specifically prescribed for aging bodies, and the science behind them is something most people, even health professionals, have never fully examined. Number 6. Legumes, beans, and lentils. The Book of Ezekiel, Chapter 4, contains a precise dietary formula. God instructs the prophet to take wheat, barley, lentils, millet, spelt, and beans, and combine them into a bread, specifying both the ingredients and the ratios. The passage has long puzzled biblical scholars. It reads like a recipe, and, nutritionally, it is a nearly complete protein source. Combining legumes with grains in a complementary amino acid pattern that modern plant-based nutrition now validates as a cornerstone of sustainable human health, the Eber's Papyrus recommends lentil preparations for digestive ailments described in terms of internal heat and swelling. In the Persian medical tradition, lentils were considered among the most regulating of foods, neither stimulating nor depleting. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Middle East, legumes were the daily caloric foundation for working populations, who displayed as multiple historical analyses of ancient skeletal remains, confirm notably low rates of the degenerative joint disease that afflicts modern sedentary population. The anti-inflammatory mechanism of legumes operates through multiple simultaneous pathways. First, their prebiotic fiber, particularly resistant starch, feeds the bifidobacterium and lactobacillus species in the large intestine that produce short-chain fatty acids butyrate, propionate, and acetate. Butyrate, in particular, maintains the integrity of the intestinal epithelial barrier. When that barrier weakens, a condition now commonly called intestinal permeability, bacterial compounds, called lipopolysaccharides, migrate into systemic circulation, triggering a chronic, low-grade inflammatory state that researchers now associate with conditions ranging from metabolic syndrome to depression to Alzheimer's disease. Second, legumes blunt postprandial blood glucose spikes, preventing the cycles of high insulin and oxidative stress that independently drive inflammation. Third, and this is underappreciated, beans and lentils are exceptionally high in polyphenols. Red kidney beans contain more polyphenols per serving than most berries. Black beans are among the highest polyphenol foods per calorie in the entire food supply. Begin with small quantities. If legumes are new to your diet, the fiber load is real, and the gut microbiome needs time to build the bacterial populations equipped to ferment it. Start with 2 to 3 tablespoons of cooked legumes daily, incorporated into existing meals, and increase over several weeks. 400 grams of cooked legumes per week, roughly 3 to 4 tablespoons per day, is the quantity consistently associated with measurable anti-inflammatory effect in large dietary studies. A can of chickpeas costs less than a cup of coffee. It contains more anti-inflammatory polyphenols than most supplement bottles. Number 5. Whole grains, especially the forgotten ones. Wheat appears in Scripture hundreds of times, but it is almost never refined wheat. The flour of the ancient world was stone ground, whole, and often fermented before baking. The bran, the outer shell of the grain, and the germ, the nutrient-dense embryo, remained intact. What we now sell in white paper bags labeled all-purpose flour is neither of those things. It is the starchy endosperm, the part that feeds the seed for about 12 hours of germination, stripped of every compound that made it worth eating. Ancient Egyptian bakers, Mesopotamian grain farmers, medieval European millers, all of them ground the whole grain. The transition to refined flour at industrial scale began in the 19th century and accelerated through the 20th. The inflammatory consequences of that transition are now being measured in clinical trials. Real whole grains, buckwheat, black rice, red sorghum, farro, barley, teff retain their bran and germ and carry with them phenolic acids, flavonoids, and in some cases, unique compounds found nowhere else in the plant kingdom. Red sorghum, in particular, deserves attention. It contains 2 unusual polyphenols, luteolinidin and apigeninidin, that belong to a class called 3-deoxyanthocyanidins. These compounds are more resistant to digestive degradation than standard anthocyanins, meaning more of them reach the colon, where they act directly on microbiome composition and intestinal barrier integrity. A study found that pasta made with red sorghum, consumed in a single meal, increased circulating polyphenol levels and measurably improved antioxidant status within 2 hours. Buckwheat carries rutin, a flavonoid, with documented effects on vascular inflammation and capillary integrity. Black rice is colored by anthocyanins structurally similar to those in blueberries. The simple rule, color is medicinal. The darker the grain, the richer the polyphenol content. White rice, white flour, white bread contain virtually none of these compounds. They were removed at the mill. Approximately 200 grams of cooked whole grain per day, a generous portion of buckwheat soba noodles, a bowl of black rice, a serving of barley, delivers the phenolic content associated with anti-inflammatory benefit. Soak whole grains overnight before cooking to reduce phytic acid, which otherwise binds to minerals and reduces their absorption. Number 4. Spices. Ginger, turmeric, and nigella. The Song of Solomon lists among the most prized goods of the ancient world nard, saffron, calamus, cinnamon, frankincense, myrrh, aloes, and all the chief spices. The imagery is erotic and poetic, but the list is also a catalog of known medicinal plants. In the ancient Near East, spices were medicine first, and flavor second. Ginger root Zingiber officinale is documented in Sanskrit medical texts dating to 700 BCE, where it was called Vishwabheshaj, the universal medicine. Roman physicians imported it from India at extraordinary expense. Arab merchants controlled its trade and kept its origins deliberately secret for centuries. What made it worth that price? Modern clinical trials suggest the answer is gingerols and shogales, volatile phenolic compounds that directly inhibit the same COX and LOX enzymes targeted by non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Multiple randomized controlled trials in people with osteoarthritis have found ginger supplementation reduces pain scores and inflammatory markers comparably to ibuprofen, without gastrointestinal side effects. About a thumb of fresh ginger, roughly 5 to 10 grams, grated into warm water with lemon. Consumed in the morning before food. Is the preparation most consistent with both traditional use and clinical dosing? Never boil it. Water above 85 degrees Celsius degrades the volatile compounds. Steep it in water just off the boil. Turmeric curcuma, longa contient curcumin, which has been studied in more than 3,000 published papers for its effects on inflammatory pathways. It directly inhibits NF-κB, the same master inflammatory switch suppressed by berries and olive oil polyphenols. Curcumin is notoriously poorly absorbed on its own, but absorption increases by up to 20 times in the presence of piperine, the active compound in black pepper. This combination, turmeric and black pepper, appears in virtually every traditional culinary system that used turmeric medicinally, from South Asian cooking to East African stew traditions to North African spice blends. The pairing predates the science by a very long time. Niella sativa blackseed, black cumin, or Habatus sauda in Arabic, may be the most consistently revered medicinal plant in Islamic medicine. The Hadith records the Prophet Muhammad saying, "In the black seed there is healing for every disease except death." That is an extraordinary claim, and the research does not support quite that scope. But what it does support is significant. Nigella's primary active compound, thymoquinone, has demonstrated anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and immune-modulating effects in both laboratory studies and human trials, with results showing measurable reduction in inflammatory markers within 2 to 4 weeks of consistent use. 1 to 2 teaspoons of whole black seeds, lightly toasted and ground with a mortar and pestle, added to bread, yogurt, or warm honey water. That is the traditional preparation and the practical dosing. 1 teaspoon of turmeric plus a pinch of black pepper, 5 grams of fresh ginger, half a teaspoon of ground nigella, in a warm cup of water or golden milk. That is a preparation with roots in 3 separate ancient medical traditions, now examined in clinical research. Drink it daily. Number 3. Anti-inflammatory drinks. Green tea, cacao, and coffee. When Jesus performed his first recorded miracle at the wedding in Cana, John 2:1-11, it was the transformation of water into a beverage. The symbolic weight of that act is theological, but it also situates the act of communal drinking what we consume together, ritually, daily, at the center of human experience in every culture across history. Every ancient civilization organized significant daily ritual around prepared drinks. The Japanese tea ceremony, the Ethiopian coffee ceremony, the Andean coca leaf preparation, the Roman mulsum wine mixed with honey and herbs, the Egyptian carcade, a preparation of hibiscus that modern research confirms is rich in anthocyanins and associated with measurable reductions in blood pressure and inflammatory markers. These drinks were not casual. They were daily medicine, administered in a social ritual that also reduced cortisol, the stress hormone that independently elevates inflammatory markers. Green tea and matcha contain epigallocatechin, gallate, EGCG, a catechin polyphenol that is one of the most extensively studied plant compounds in nutritional research. with documented effects on NF-κB suppression, vascular endothelial function, and modulation of the gut microbiome. Matcha, which involves consuming the entire tea leaf ground into powder rather than steeping and discarding it, delivers approximately 3 times the EGCG concentration of brewed green tea. The preparation is critical water at 80 degrees Celsius. Not boiling preserves the catechin structure. Boiling water degrades EGCG by up to 30%. Raw cacao, not processed cocoa, not chocolate bars, but minimally processed cacao powder or cacao nibs, contains a class of flavonoids called procyanidins that have demonstrated effects on inflammatory cytokine production in several clinical trials. Cacao was used ceremonially by the Maya and Aztec as a bitter, medicinal drink consumed unsweetened, sometimes mixed with chili and spices. In the opposite of what chocolate has become in commercial form, the processing of commercial chocolate alkalizing, conching, adding milk solids and sugar destroys the majority of the procyanidin content. 1 tablespoon of raw cacao powder stirred into 80-degree water with nothing added delivers an approximation of the original preparation. Coffee, when made from high-quality beans and consumed without excessive sugar or ultra-processed creamers, is one of the richest sources of chlorogenic acids in the modern diet. These phenolic compounds have strong antioxidant activity and, in more than 20,000 studies, have been associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, and liver cirrhosis, all conditions with significant inflammatory components. 2 to 3 cups before midday is the dosing most consistently associated with benefit. Mountain water process decaffeination preserves the polyphenols for those sensitive to caffeine. The lesson the ancients understood is that daily ritual matters. What you drink every morning, every afternoon, shapes your inflammatory baseline over years. Not dramatically in any single cup. Cumulatively, the way water shapes stone. Number 2. Extra virgin olive oil blended into a daily protocol. And the forgotten bitter herbs. The Passover Seder has been observed by Jewish communities for roughly 3,000 years. At its center is a meal with specific, prescribed components, each carrying symbolic weight. Among the most persistent and least discussed of these components is the maror, the bitter herbs, horseradish, endive, romaine, bitter greens that, in later rabbinic interpretation, were to be consumed with specificity about preparation fresh, uncrushed until the moment of consumption, and eaten in sufficient quantity to register their bitterness. Bitter herbs appear across ancient medical traditions, with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. Roman physicians prescribed bitter plants before meals to stimulate liver function. Ayurvedic medicine built an entire category, tikta, or bitter taste, around the principle that bitter compounds prime the digestive fire and reduce internal inflammation. Traditional Chinese medicine prescribed bitter herbs coptis, gentian, andrographis, specifically for conditions described as excess heat, which maps closely to inflammatory states. What these traditions were observing was the effect of bitter compounds called iridoids, isothiocyanates, and sesquiterpene lactones on bile production, liver detoxification, and the regulation of inflammatory signaling through the gut-liver axis. Dandelion greens, which grow as weeds across most of the temperate world and cost nothing to harvest, contain luteolin and apigenin flavonoids, with documented anti-inflammatory effects on macrophage activation. Artichoke contains cynarin and silymarin, compounds that protect hepatocytes from oxidative damage and reduce liver-derived inflammatory markers. Endive, chicory, radicchio, and Belgian endive all contain inulin, a prebiotic fiber that specifically feeds the anti-inflammatory species Bifidobacterium, longum, and Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. The preparation principle here: across every tradition, eat them raw, or minimally cooked, and eat them first, before the rest of the meal. The bitterness is the medicine. commercial processing that removes bitterness, as is done with much modern lettuce breeding. With most chicory products, with nearly all endive cultivated for the supermarket shelf, removes the therapeutic compound along with it. Seek out the bitter dandelion greens, tossed with olive oil and lemon. Steamed artichoke, eaten petal by petal. Radicchio, served simply with salt. The bitterness that makes your face contract slightly is a signal worth reading. It is thousands of years of accumulated pharmacological knowledge written into the flavor. Number 1. The gut microbiome foods. Fermented and prebiotic combinations. The oldest continuous health prescription in recorded human history may be fermented food, archaeological evidence of deliberate fermentation, kimchi-like preparations in Korea, kefir and kumis across the Eurasian steppe, kvass in Slavic regions, injera in Ethiopia, tepache in Mesoamerica. Kishk in the ancient Near East dates to at least 10,000 years ago. Every major human civilization, independently and without knowledge of each other's practices, arrived at the same discovery. Fermenting food made it more nourishing, more stable, and more medicinal. The Hebrew Talmud describes leban, a fermented milk product, similar to what we now call kefir, as a daily food, with specific benefits for digestive health. The Persian tradition, recorded in Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, describes fermented grain preparations as superior to fresh grain for those with weak digestion. In Japan, miso fermented soybean paste has been documented as a dietary staple with medicinal applications for over 1,000 years. The Benchao Gangmu devotes substantial attention to fermented preparations, classifying them as fundamentally different from their unfermented counterparts. What these traditions were observing without the vocabulary to describe it was the microbiome. The trillions of microorganisms living in the human colon are not passive inhabitants. They are a functioning metabolic organ, collectively weighing between 1 and 2 kilograms, that produces neurotransmitters, regulates immune function, metabolizes hormones, produces vitamins, and directly modulates the production of inflammatory cytokines throughout the body. An imbalanced microbiome, what researchers now call dysbiosis, is now associated with conditions ranging from rheumatoid arthritis to depression to colorectal cancer, and the inflammatory consequences of dysbiosis are systemic, not localized. When the microbiome is disturbed, the inflammation it produces is felt everywhere. Fermented foods replenish and diversify the microbial community. Kefir, made from fermented milk, contains up to 60 distinct probiotic strains, including Lactobacillus kefiranophaciens, which produces a specific polysaccharide called kefirin that has shown anti-inflammatory and anti-tumor activity in laboratory studies. Sauerkraut and kimchi, when raw and unpasteurized, deliver live Leuconostoc and Lactobacillus species that colonize the gut lining and compete with pro-inflammatory bacteria. Miso, particularly traditionally fermented miso, aged for more than 1 year, contains compounds produced during fermentation, including GABA, free isoflavones, and specific peptides that have shown blood pressure lowering and anti-inflammatory effects in human trials. The preparation instruction that separates medicinal fermented foods from commercial imitations is singular. The food must never be heated above 115 degrees Fahrenheit after fermentation, or the live cultures are destroyed. Commercially pasteurized sauerkraut from a jar on a supermarket shelf contains no live cultures. Pickled cucumbers preserved in vinegar contain no live cultures. The product you want is raw, unpasteurized, and stored cold. In most communities, this means either a specialty health food store, a farmer's market producer, or making it yourself, which requires only a vegetable, salt, a jar, and 5 to 7 days. 2 tablespoons of raw sauerkraut alongside your main meal. A half cup of plain kefir in the morning. 1 teaspoon of aged miso dissolved in warm, not boiling water, poured over cooked grains. That is the daily fermentation protocol. It is not expensive. It is not complex. It is 10,000 years old. But here is the point that ties everything on this list together, and the point most people miss even after they understand each food individually. The compounds that make every food on this list anti-inflammatory, the anthocyanins in berries, the sulforaphane in sprouts, the oleocanthal in olive oil, the lignans in flaxseed, the thymoquinone in black seed, the EGCG in green tea, the live cultures in fermented foods, all of them are fragile. They are not stable industrial compounds engineered to survive a 2-year shelf life in a warehouse. They are living biochemical structures that degrade with heat, light, oxygen, and time. The industrial food system is not designed to protect these compounds. It is designed to extend shelf life, standardize flavor, and maximize caloric density per dollar. These are not compatible goals with preserving the active compounds we've discussed today. This is why every tradition on Earth that relied on these foods for medicine prepared them fresh, minimally processed, as close to their whole form as possible. The Egyptian physician, the Ayurvedic healer, the Chinese herbalist, the Mediterranean grandmother, none of them had clinical trials. But all of them had the empirical result of generations of careful observation. They noticed what worked. They recorded it. They passed it on. The laboratory is now working to understand why they were right. What we are only beginning to examine, and what may be the most important question in nutritional science over the next 20 years, is this. If the foods themselves are this powerful, when consumed whole and fresh, what has been lost in the last century of industrial processing? What chronic conditions are we carrying today that might not exist if these compounds remained intact in our daily food supply? That question doesn't have a complete answer yet, but it is worth sitting with. If this kind of knowledge resonates with you, the convergence of ancient wisdom and emerging science, the practical power of real food, like this video and subscribe, and share it with someone in your life who needs to hear that their health doesn't require a pharmacy or an expensive supplement protocol. It requires paying attention to what has always been true. Tell us in the comments, which of these 12 foods surprised you most, and what topic would you like us to explore next? As always, this content is for educational purposes only. Please consult your physician or registered dietitian before making significant changes to your diet, especially if you are managing a chronic condition or taking medication. The goal here is to give you knowledge, not to replace the professional guidance that your individual health requires. The food is real. The history is real. The science is still developing. But the direction it points in, toward whole foods, ancienne préparation, and daily consistency, that is the same direction it has always pointed. Pay attention to what the oldest traditions in the world chose to eat. They were not eating for pleasure alone. They were eating for survival. And many of them survived remarkably well.